In February of 1945, during the height of World War II in the Pacific Theater, on a small island just off the coast of Burma, nearly 900 Japanese soldiers met a gruesome fate, and it was not at the hands of the Allies. But before we get into that story, welcome back to Dark Wilderness, where I share encounters with the unexplained. If you've had an encounter that you would like to share, please email it to me at the link below. And if you like today's story, please gently slap that like button, as I'll be uploading multiple times every week. So don't forget to keep that subscribe button close as you make your way through that mangrove swamp so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounter. Today's story takes place on Ramree Island during January and February of 1945 during the height of World War II in the South Pacific. Ramree Island's located just off the coast of Burma, and it covers a land area of about 1,350 square kilometers. It's the largest of the islands in the area, and in 1942 the Imperial Japanese Army laid claim to Ramree Island. On January 14th of 1945, the British and the Indian forces started Operation Matador. Their primary objective for this operation was to retake Ramree Island as well as the neighboring island of Chidoba from the Imperial Japanese. The reason for that was because they wanted to construct airstrips on both those islands so that they would be able to quickly and more effectively supply the troops on the mainland during the fighting there. The operation was supposed to be strictly an amphibious assault with the key objective of capturing the strategic port of Kyakpyu. However, on the 14th, new reconnaissance came to light that showed that the Japanese had actually already started to prepare for this landing. They had started setting up various defensive positions and started putting artillery batteries inside of these different caves that overlooked the beachhead where those troops would be landing. As a countermeasure, the British Royal Navy called in an armada of ships to provide a naval bombardment of the area prior to the troops landing. This armada included one battleship, which was the HMS Queen Elizabeth, one escort carrier, which was the HMS Amir, one light cruiser, which was the HMS Phoebe, and 4 destroyers, which were the Rapid, the Napier, the Normand, and the Pathfinder. There were also 2 Black Swan-class sloops, which were the Flamingo and the HMIS Kisna. The unit tasked with taking the beach was the 71st Indian Infantry Brigade, and shortly before their landing craft made their way for that beach, that naval armada opened up fire on all those different Japanese positions. Immediately following that naval bombardment, the Royal Air Force provided aerial bombardments along with strafing runs of those same positions. The reason for that was to try to eliminate as many of the enemies as possible prior to that landing party getting to the beach, as well as to provide them cover while advancing as well. However, that landing party was delayed because a couple of the vessels actually hit sea mines on the way to the beach. But once they hit the beach, they found it relatively unopposed. They came across very little Japanese resistance, if any, and they were able to take that beach by that afternoon. By the 23rd, they had advanced to taking Kyakpyu. From there, they advanced down the west coast and took the village of Mayan 2 days later. The next day, they advanced to Yongbak-chan, where they encountered incredibly strong Japanese resistance. However, on the 31st, they were reinforced by the 4th Brigade. The 71st Infantry Battalion was then ordered northeast inland to the village of Seine and then south to Ramree town, with the plan being that the 4th Brigade would stay back at Yongbak-chan fighting the Japanese, and if the Japanese did fall, then the 4th Brigade would come up the rear and meet up with the 71st as they made their way into Ramree town. When the 71st got to Seine, they encountered really strong Japanese resistance. There was about 1,000 Japanese soldiers dug in at Seine. However, come February 1st, the British Royal Marines had landed on Ramree to assist them with taking the island. A few days before, the British Royal Marines had actually landed on the neighboring island of Chidoba. However, when they landed there, they found that that island was completely unoccupied. So they had since been relieved by the 34th Indian Infantry Brigade, and that allowed them to head to Ramree to assist with taking Ramree Island. The Japanese, now realizing that they were being flanked by the British, made the decision to abandon their stronghold at Seine and head across the island to meet up with a larger Japanese force on the other side. However, to get there, the route that they would have to take was a 16-kilometer or 9.9 miles of this thick, almost impenetrable mangrove swamp. Now, the Japanese had been on this island since 1942, and they knew full well the dangers of this particular swamp, and they also knew exactly what lived in this swamp. And what lived in that swamp, aside from venomous snakes and disease-carrying mosquitoes, were thousands of saltwater crocodiles. Now, even knowing this, the Japanese had an undying conviction of no surrender, so to them it was worth it to take their chances crossing this swamp than to be dishonored by surrendering to the British or to the Indian militaries. The remaining 900 Japanese soldiers, many of which who were already wounded, dehydrated, or fighting disease from those disease-carrying mosquitoes, they grabbed their gear and they headed into that mangrove swamp. Once they were in there, the Allied forces pretty much encircled the swamp, trapping the Japanese inside. So once they were trapped, they had no choice at all but to continue going through the swamp. Every once in a while, one of the sick or the wounded would start to stagger behind, and all their comrades would hear up ahead would be a scream followed by a splash. They would turn and look, and that person would be gone. Until moments later, they would hear thrashing and splashing of water, which was the telltale signs of a crocodile's signature death roll. Those sounds struck fear into the hearts of the Japanese soldiers, and they began firing at any sign of a crocodile as they advanced through this mangrove swamp. Because crocodiles are opportunistic hunters, they would just lie in wait for another soldier to start staggering behind, and then they would get that one as well. Over time, more and more of these saltwater crocs were drawn to this area because of the abundant new food source, and that food source was these Japanese soldiers. So the Japanese, they started clustering together in larger groups. However, that did not help. These crocodiles would go into these larger groups, pick somebody off, pull them into the water, drown them, and then go after somebody else. At one point, it was like these crocodiles were killing for fun and not just to eat. While this was going on inside the swamp, the British and the Indian forces surrounding the swamp, all they could hear all times of the day were the screams and the sporadic gunfire from the Japanese as they were devoured by these saltwater crocodiles. It was especially bad at night. Those screams would increase and the sporadic gunfire would increase as well. The Japanese inside the swamp at night, they would try to set up a camp on any type of high ground that they could find in there. However, these crocodiles, they would come up at the camp, grab victims, and they pull them into the muddy water of the swamp. This went on for days. Slowly, the Japanese soldiers, one by one, being picked off by these saltwater crocodiles. Meanwhile, the Allied forces that surrounded the swamps would continue to hear those screams and hear that gunfire from inside. Until February 11th, the Japanese launched an air raid which severely damaged one of the British destroyers, and that offered enough of a distraction so that the mainland Japan was able to send 40 rescue craft across to Ramree to evacuate the remaining Japanese. The remaining Japanese were picked up by those landing craft, and 500 soldiers were evacuated back to mainland Japan. Now, of the 900 soldiers that entered those mangrove swamps, only 20 ever made it out. The exact number of men that were killed inside the swamps will never fully be known because some of those men likely died from disease or from previous wounds. However, the massacre of Ramree Swamp remains the single most horrific attack of crocodiles on humans in history. The population of the crocodiles on Ramree Island were heavily hunted starting in the 1960s, and only a very small population of those saltwater crocs remain there today. Well, that's it for today's story. I actually had an email request about this one shortly after doing the one about that swamp creature in the Everglades. They just wanted to know if I knew anything about this incident and if I'd ever consider doing an episode on it. And since we just did an episode on a swamp creature and I'm a little bit of a history buff, I thought this would be a perfect time to do it. So I really hope you guys enjoyed this one. And as always, if you have any comments, please leave them in the comments below. And if you haven't done so already, keep that subscribe button close as you make your way through the mangrove swamp, and I'll see you next time.